March 23, 1945, 2100 hours, western bank of the Rhine River near Wessel, Germany. Oberst Wilhelm Steinberg steadied his binoculars as darkness crept across the river's surface. The motion was subtle, barely noticeable, but the fatigue of years of war showed in his hands. He paused, then wrote carefully in his field notebook, a document that would later be recovered by Allied intelligence at Army Group headquarters. "The Americans have reached our sacred river," he noted, "but they cannot cross it." For Steinberg and the German officers around him, this belief was not optimism, it was doctrine. No modern army, they believed, had ever forced a crossing of the Rhine against organized German resistance without first constructing bridges that could be shattered by artillery before armor ever rolled across. Across the river, flashes of light tore through the gathering dusk. Allied artillery was firing in massive concentrations, thousands of guns preparing what German commanders assumed would be a conventional assault. To Steinberg, it looked familiar: suppression fire, preparatory bombardment, the opening act of a crossing that would require days, perhaps weeks of exposed engineering work. For 2,000 years, the Rhine had shielded Germany from invaders. Roman legions had halted at its banks. Napoleon had struggled against it. Even now, with the Reich collapsing from both east and west, German engineers insisted the river's width, over 1,300 feet in places, and its swift current made rapid crossings impossible without fixed bridges. What Steinberg did not know was that 2,000 soldiers of the British 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion, the Black Watch, were preparing to enter the water in a way German intelligence had catastrophically misunderstood. They were not boarding fragile assault boats. They were not waiting for pontoon bridges to be assembled under fire. Instead, they were loading into strange, boat-shaped vehicles, machines German analysts had observed before, yet never truly understood. The duck amphibious truck. German intelligence had seen them in Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy. Analysts dismissed them as novelty landing craft, useful only for beach supply operations. River warfare, they concluded, followed immutable laws. Assault boats first, engineers next, bridges last. Those assumptions were about to collapse. The failure began months earlier inside German intelligence offices. After the war, General Oberst Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, would admit to Allied interrogators that the Wehrmacht fundamentally misread American amphibious capability. Reports mentioning Schwimmwagen trucks were treated as curiosities, grouped alongside stories of ice cream ships and mobile Coca-Cola factories. Major Hans-Georg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model, kept a diary while serving with the 1st Parachute Army. Captured in April 1945, it revealed the confidence German officers placed in Rhine doctrine. River crossings, they believed, were predictable. Attackers needed time, fixed crossing points, and massive engineering support. All of these could be destroyed. Captured intelligence files later exposed how badly the Germans miscalculated. An officer in the 15th Army mentioned the duck only 3 times in 6 months of reports, and each time dismissed it as irrelevant to inland operations. Estimates suggested the Allies possessed perhaps a few dozen such vehicles. The reality was overwhelming. By March 1945, more than 2,000 ducks operated in Northwest Europe. The U.S. Army had organized them into amphibious truck companies, each with 50 vehicles and trained crews. British forces had received thousands more through Lend-Lease. Canadian units operated hundreds with cold weather modifications. These units had trained quietly, repeatedly, practicing river crossings that German intelligence never detected. The duck itself was born from a minor accident. In April 1942, a Coast Guard boat grounded on a sandbar in Massachusetts. Conventional trucks could not reach it. The solution, a vehicle that could travel seamlessly from land to water, seemed impractical. Ford declined the concept. GM accepted. In just 38 days, engineers combined a standard 2.5-ton truck with a watertight hull. Central tire inflation allowed the vehicle to adjust pressure on the move. A rear propeller provided water propulsion. A rudder linked to the steering wheel allowed control without transition. It wasn't elegant, it was effective. By war's end, more than 21,000 ducks had rolled off assembly lines. They cost a fraction of German amphibious vehicles and shared parts with standard trucks, making them easy to maintain and replace. As March 1945 approached, German commanders refused to acknowledge the weakening reality of their defenses. The first parachute army had been shattered in the Reichswald. Reinforcements consisted of Volkssturm units, boys and old men, poorly armed and barely trained. Still, faith remained in the river. Feldwebel Otto Kraus wrote to his wife on March 20th, "The Americans are across from us now. We hear them day and night, but the Rhine protects us. Even Napoleon failed here." German doctrine promised time, 2 to 3 days to react after the first crossings. Mobile reserves would counterattack, bridges would be destroyed, the river would hold. At 2100 hours, the first ducks entered the Rhine. They did not return. They drove straight up the eastern bank and vanished into the darkness. The river had not been breached. It had been ignored. German confidence in the Rhine as an absolute barrier rested on years of carefully constructed doctrine. Every officer trained in river defense understood the sequence by heart. First came suppression fire to break up assault formations, then infantry crossing in fragile boats, followed by engineers struggling forward to build bridges under constant attack. Only after bridgeheads were secured would armor and supplies flow. Each step created predictable choke points, targets German gunners knew how to destroy. That was the war the Wehrmacht had prepared to fight. What they had not prepared for was an enemy who could skip every step. By the night of March 23rd, Allied planners had assembled the largest concentration of amphibious vehicles ever seen in a river operation. Hundreds of DUKWs sat concealed in wooded areas, farm lanes, and ruined villages within miles of the Rhine's western bank. Each vehicle had been inspected, waterproofed, and loaded according to strict weight calculations that ensured stability in fast current. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, commanding one of the amphibious truck companies, later recalled the preparation. "This was not Normandy," he said. "There were no tides to consider, no beaches to clear. The Rhine was about speed and current, about getting in, getting across, and getting out before the enemy understood what was happening." His crews practiced for weeks on rivers with similar flow, learning to compensate for drift, calculating entry points upstream so the current would carry them to intended exits. The DUKWs themselves reflected 3 years of battlefield adaptation. Armor plates protected drivers and engines. Ring mounts supported 50 caliber machine guns for self-defense. Bilge pumps, far more powerful than in early models, could keep a vehicle afloat even when riddled with small arms fire. These were not improvised craft. They were purpose-refined machines built for sustained combat use. Captain James Mitchell, briefing his men hours before the crossing, understood the stakes. They were not support units tonight. They were the assault. Each DUKW would carry a full rifle squad, weapons, ammunition, radios, everything needed to fight immediately upon landing. They would cross once, not shuttle back and forth. Their mission was simple and unprecedented: drive through the Rhine, drive up the opposite bank, and place infantry directly into battle positions. Alongside them, British forces prepared their own amphibious assault. General Percy Hobart's 79th Armored Division brought hundreds of Buffalo amphibious tractors capable of carrying entire platoons. Together, American DUKWs and British Buffaloes formed a crossing force unlike anything German planners had ever imagined. At 1700 hours, the bombardment began. More than 4,000 Allied guns opened fire simultaneously. From light field artillery to massive 240mm howitzers, shells poured onto the eastern bank in a continuous storm. German observers described the riverbank as boiling, the air vibrating with an unbroken roar. One officer later wrote that it felt less like individual explosions and more like standing inside a furnace made of steel. German artillery units attempted to respond, but communications were already faltering. Observation posts struggled to relay accurate coordinates through the chaos. The barrage was not merely destructive, it was paralyzing. At exactly 2100 hours, under cover of darkness and smoke, the first DUKWs rolled forward. They entered the river upstream from their targets, engines roaring as currents grabbed hold of their hulls. Drivers corrected constantly, steering as if navigating aircraft through crosswinds. Water slapped against steel sides. Tracer rounds stitched the surface. Shells splashed nearby, sending columns of water skyward. Inside the vehicles, soldiers gripped rifles and equipment, bracing against the motion. Sergeant Robert McPherson of the Black Watch later described the sensation. One moment they were driving downhill like any road, the next the vehicle lifted, floating free, water rushing past faster than anything he had experienced. The American driver never slowed, he simply kept driving. Some DUKWs were swept hundreds of yards downstream. It didn't matter. Unlike assault boats tied to precise landing points, these vehicles could climb almost any bank they reached. They drove straight out of the river wherever terrain allowed, scattering Allied infantry across a wide front. By 2200 hours, the first wave was already inland. German defenders, listening for the return of assault boats or the hammering of bridge construction, heard nothing but continued artillery fire. No engines revving in reverse, no pontoons clanking into place. The crossing had already happened. By dawn on March 24th, reports reaching German headquarters defied comprehension. Enemy troops were appearing miles behind the river line. Entire battalions were deploying inland with mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank weapons already in position. A German 88mm battery commander radioed desperately, reporting enemy forces behind his guns. Bridges were gone. No pontoon construction had been observed. The situation made no sense. What German commanders were facing was not armor, yet, but infantry delivered by amphibious trucks that had bypassed every defended approach. DUKWs had turned the Rhine from a wall into an open field of entry points. As fog lifted that morning, the scale became unmistakable. Hundreds of DUKWs streamed back and forth across the river. They did not move in columns toward a single bridgehead. They crossed everywhere. German observers counted crossings along a front more than 20 miles wide. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann recorded the moment in his diary. The defensive plan assumed 6 or 8 crossing sites that could be saturated with fire. Instead, the enemy was crossing at dozens of points simultaneously. No artillery could cover that many targets. The Rhine defense, carefully prepared, meticulously planned, had no answer. The river had not delayed the Allies. It had delivered them. As daylight spread across the eastern bank of the Rhine on March 24, German commanders began to understand that something fundamentally different was unfolding. This was not a bridgehead battle. There was no single focal point to isolate, no narrow corridor to smash with artillery. Allied forces were already dispersed inland, appearing in places that should have been unreachable. Major Karl Richelt, commanding an 88mm battery near Rees, sent a frantic message up the chain of command. Enemy forces, he reported, were operating behind his position. All bridges had been destroyed, no pontoons had been seen, yet American infantry with heavy weapons were already 3 miles inland. He asked the question every German officer was now asking: how? The answer lay in the continuous movement of amphibious trucks. Unlike assault boats, which had to shuttle back and forth, DUKWs crossed once and kept moving. They carried mortars, machine guns, anti-tank guns, radios, and ammunition directly from the western bank into firing positions. German strongpoints placed to dominate obvious exit routes found themselves bypassed. Defensive fire plans collapsed as units were attacked from directions no one had prepared to defend. By mid-morning, German artillery observers reported crossings occurring all along a 22-mile front. This was beyond anything German doctrine could counter. The Wehrmacht's river defense philosophy depended on concentrating firepower at predictable locations. Now there were no predictable locations. British forces added to the chaos. At Wesel, the British Second Army executed its own crossing using a coordinated mix of DUKWs and Buffalo amphibious vehicles. The 15th Scottish Division crossed with full equipment loads, while American amphibious trucks followed close behind, bringing artillery ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies directly to the front. By 0800 hours, 3 Allied divisions were across the river and fighting on the eastern bank. Then, the sky filled with aircraft. At 1000 hours, Operation Varsity began. More than 1,700 transport aircraft and over 1,300 gliders poured across the river, delivering 16,000 airborne troops in the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. German commanders expected airborne drops deep behind their lines, isolated and vulnerable. Instead, Allied paratroopers landed within artillery range of the river crossings, directly reinforcing the amphibious assault. German officers watching from the ground initially believed the airborne drop was the main effort. Only later did they realize the truth. The river had already been crossed in force. The coordination was devastating. DUKWs delivered ammunition and medical supplies directly to airborne units, eliminating the need for risky resupply drops. Wounded paratroopers were evacuated back across the Rhine in the same vehicles that had carried them into battle, something unheard of in previous airborne operations. Private First Class Donald Burgett of the 17th Airborne later recalled fighting for a crossroads when vehicles appeared that seemed to defy reality. Amphibious trucks emerged from tree lines, dripping river water, offering ammunition and medical aid. For soldiers trained to expect isolation, it felt unreal. By midday, German command structures were unraveling. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, managing logistics for the Allied crossing, described what he called DUKW highways. Trucks loaded with supplies drove into the river, crossed, and delivered directly to frontline units without unloading or delay. There were no bridges to bomb, no choke points to target. Supplies flowed continuously. At peak operations, 50 DUKWs crossed per hour at a single site. Each carried either 2.5 tons of cargo or 25 soldiers. That meant more than 100 tons of supplies, or over 1,000 troops every hour, without bridges, without engineers exposed on the riverbank. German defenders searched in vain for structures to destroy. There were none. The psychological impact was immediate and severe. Feldwebel Hermann Gutz wrote that blowing bridges had become meaningless. The enemy didn't need them. Rivers had ceased to exist as obstacles. By the afternoon of March 24th, German counterattack plans collapsed. Units that moved toward expected bridgeheads found Allied forces already behind them. Orders conflicted with reality. Reports conflicted. Commanders could not identify where to strike. When General Alfred Schlemm convened his senior officers that morning, the message was grim. According to later testimony, he admitted they had prepared for the wrong kind of war. The Allies had not assaulted the Rhine fortress, they had gone around it. In the first 48 hours, more than 15,000 Allied troops crossed the river by amphibious vehicles. Over 1,200 vehicles followed. Artillery was firing from the eastern bank before German headquarters fully grasped that the crossing had succeeded. Attempts to counterattack dissolved into confusion. German units encountered enemy formations where none should have existed. The defensive map no longer matched reality. The Rhine, the final natural barrier, had not slowed the advance. It had accelerated it. By the morning of March 25th, the reality confronting German commanders had turned from confusion into despair. What had been conceived as a defensive stand along Germany's most sacred river had become an operational catastrophe, unfolding faster than anyone could contain. The Rhine was no longer a line to be held. It had become irrelevant. General Alfred Schlemm, commanding the 1st Parachute Army, convened an emergency conference in a farmhouse near Brunnen. Survivors later reconstructed the meeting from captured notes and post-war interrogations. Schlemm spoke bluntly. The army, he said, had prepared to fight the last war. Every assumption about bridges, choke points, and time had been rendered useless by Allied amphibious vehicles. Numbers arriving at headquarters were staggering. In less than 2 days, DUKWs had carried more men and material across the Rhine than traditional river crossings could have managed in weeks. Artillery pieces were already firing eastward. Infantry units were entrenched miles inland. German reserves had no clear target to counterattack. Panzer Brigade 106 attempted to strike near Wesel on March 25th. Its commander later recorded the futility of the effort. There was no bridgehead to destroy, no narrow penetration to seal off. Allied forces were spread across a 15-kilometer front, continuously reinforced by amphibious vehicles. The counterattack collapsed under airstrikes and artillery fire before it could gain momentum. British formations experienced similar success. Scottish divisions pushed 6 miles inland in a single day, supported by uninterrupted amphibious supply. Forward artillery observers moved freely in DUKWs, repositioning faster than German counter-battery fire could react. The river crossing had become a sustained flow rather than a discrete event. This success exposed a deeper imbalance, one rooted not in tactics but in production. Germany had its own amphibious vehicle, the Landwasserschlepper. Technically impressive, heavily armored, and tracked, it outperformed the DUKW in difficult terrain, but it was also expensive, complex, and slow to manufacture. Fewer than 100 were ever produced. Many never reached combat units. The DUKW, by contrast, was not elegant. It was adequate. Built from standard truck components, it could be assembled quickly, repaired easily, and operated by minimally trained soldiers. Master Sergeant Edwin Coleman, responsible for vehicle maintenance during the crossing, later explained the advantage simply. If something broke, they fixed it. If they couldn't fix it, they replaced it. German vehicles required specialists. American vehicles required mechanics. This philosophy extended to operations. Any soldier who could drive a truck could learn to operate a DUKW in hours. German amphibious vehicles demanded crews trained for months. American planners assumed citizen soldiers. German planners assumed professionals. The results spoke for themselves. Personal encounters revealed the psychological shock this caused among German troops. Private James Harlan of the 89th Infantry Division remembered his first sight of the amphibious trucks. Expecting assault boats, he instead boarded a wheeled vehicle driven by a Navy sailor deep inside Germany. The absurdity of it struck everyone involved. German prisoners expressed disbelief. One captured soldier repeatedly asked how the American Navy could be operating hundreds of miles from the ocean. He could not reconcile what he was seeing with any model of warfare he understood. By March 26th, resistance began to crumble wholesale. Units surrendered not because they had been annihilated, but because the logic of continued defense no longer existed. The Rhine's failure shattered morale across the Western Front. Entire battalions abandoned positions once Allied forces appeared behind them. Commanders realized that if the Rhine could not stop the advance, nothing else could. Statistics from those 72 hours revealed the scale of transformation. Over 5,000 DUKW crossings were completed. 15,000 troops crossed. 1,200 vehicles followed. 3,000 tons of supplies were delivered. 2,000 wounded were evacuated, many within an hour of injury. Traditional bridging operations would have taken weeks and cost tens of thousands of lives. The DUKWs had turned river assault into transportation. German diaries captured the despair. Soldiers wrote that the Americans seemed endless, that no matter how many were killed, more arrived. And worse, they arrived everywhere. One prisoner summarized the collapse simply during interrogation. If the enemy could drive trucks across the Rhine, the war was finished. He was correct. The collapse of organized resistance along the Rhine triggered a chain reaction that German command could neither slow nor control. What had begun as a defensive failure rapidly became a strategic unraveling. Units that had planned to fight delaying actions found themselves bypassed, surrounded, or rendered irrelevant before orders could even be issued. On March 26th, Allied exploitation began in earnest. With the river no longer an obstacle, armored formations poured eastward. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, crossed in record time, its tanks and support vehicles fed across by an uninterrupted flow of amphibious trucks. Crews described the surreal sight of DUKWs still dripping river water racing along German autobahns, carrying fuel and ammunition directly to advancing spearheads. Major General Isaac White later reported that his division advanced nearly 50 miles in a single day. Under any previous doctrine, such speed would have been impossible. Traditional river crossings required pauses, time to consolidate bridgeheads, stockpile supplies, and repair infrastructure. The DUKWs eliminated that pause entirely. Logistics moved at the same pace as combat units. German attempts to establish blocking positions failed repeatedly. Units racing to defensive lines encountered Allied troops already in place. When questioned, American soldiers simply pointed to the amphibious trucks behind them. They had crossed rivers wherever they pleased, without waiting. This phenomenon destroyed the coherence of German operational planning. River lines that once anchored defensive strategy were meaningless. The rigid doctrine that defined where armies could move no longer applied. Medical evacuation revealed another overlooked consequence. Captain Dorothy Anderson, serving with a field hospital west of the Rhine, described wounded soldiers arriving faster than ever before. Casualties were loaded directly into DUKWs on the eastern bank and driven across the river without transfer. In many cases, wounded men reached surgery within an hour, an outcome unheard of in previous river operations. German morale collapsed alongside their defensive plans. Diaries and interrogation reports revealed a common realization. The war had entered a phase Germany could not survive. Blown bridges no longer mattered. Artillery registrations were useless when crossings occurred everywhere. Defensive preparations had been meticulous, but they were built on assumptions that no longer held. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, saw the danger clearly. His forces were being split apart faster than they could maneuver. Communications broke down as headquarters retreated or were overrun. By March 29th, Model issued a final order acknowledging reality. Continued resistance, he wrote, would only increase suffering. He released his soldiers from their oath. The psychological impact extended beyond the front lines. German civilians, long told the Rhine would hold, watched Allied vehicles appear in their towns days after the crossing began. The suddenness shattered any remaining belief in negotiated peace or miracle weapons. One civilian near Wesel recalled expecting weeks of battle. Instead, American trucks, still wet from the river, passed through within 3 days. The conclusion was unavoidable. If the Rhine could be crossed this easily, resistance was pointless. The strategic consequences were immediate. Allied speed prevented systematic destruction of infrastructure. Factories, rail hubs, and supply depots that might have prolonged the war were captured intact. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart, was encircled before defenses could be reorganized. Post-war analysis estimated the Rhine crossing shortened the war in Europe by several weeks. General Omar Bradley later calculated that a traditional assault would have cost at least 50,000 additional Allied casualties. The amphibious trucks transformed what should have been a bloodbath into a logistical operation. The shock even reached Berlin. In late March, Joseph Goebbels recorded that Germany's last natural barrier was gone. The war, he wrote, was lost not just militarily, but psychologically. The enemy had demonstrated a capacity Germany could not match. The Rhine had been more than a river. It was a symbol. Its rapid crossing marked the moment that symbol died. And with it, any remaining hope of stopping the Allied advance. In the days following the Rhine crossing, the scale of what had occurred became impossible to ignore. German commanders, Allied generals, and civilian observers all arrived at the same conclusion from different directions. A fundamental rule of warfare had been broken. For centuries, rivers defined campaigns. They dictated where armies could move, where battles would be fought, and where defenders could buy time. The Rhine was not merely another obstacle. It was Germany's last mythic line of defense, woven into military doctrine, national identity, and propaganda. Its sudden irrelevance signaled not just defeat, but obsolescence. Captured German intelligence files compiled after the collapse revealed how complete the miscalculation had been. Reports from late February 1945 estimated Allied amphibious vehicles suitable for river operations at no more than 150. The true figure exceeded 2,000 in the 21st Army Group alone. Even more damaging was the conceptual failure. German analysts never imagined these vehicles would be used en masse as primary assault platforms. They prepared to destroy bridges. The Allies simply stopped needing them. General Reinhard Gehlen, later founder of West Germany's intelligence service, acknowledged the error bluntly in his post-war memoirs. Germany, he wrote, projected its own limitations on its enemy. Because German industry could not produce amphibious vehicles in quantity, German intelligence assumed the Americans could not either. This assumption proved fatal. The comparison between vehicles told the deeper story. Germany's Landwasserschlepper was, on paper, a superior machine, armored, tracked, technically elegant. But fewer than 100 were ever built. Each required skilled labor, specialized materials, and long assembly times. The American DUKW, by contrast, was inelegant, lightly armored, and imperfect. It shared parts with standard trucks. It could be built quickly, repaired easily, and operated by minimally trained crews. General Motors produced more than 21,000. Quantity became quality. Maintenance crews kept the amphibious trucks running under fire, patching hulls with scrap metal and improvising repairs as needed. British and American operators adapted tactics on the fly, using DUKWs for evacuation, supply, reconnaissance, and even rescue operations under fire. The vehicle's flexibility multiplied its impact far beyond its original design. German officers who survived the campaign repeatedly returned to the same observation during interrogation. They had prepared for the last war. The Allies brought a different one. Colonel General Heinz Guderian later remarked that Germany had perfected the art of warfare, while the Americans perfected the business of warfare. At the Rhine, business defeated art. The psychological effect on German troops was decisive. Soldiers who might have continued fighting abandoned positions once they realized the river no longer mattered. Resistance dissolved into isolated pockets rather than organized defense. Surrenders increased dramatically after March 26, not because of battlefield losses alone, but because belief had collapsed. The DUKWs did not just carry soldiers, they carried certainty. Churchill, who insisted on crossing the Rhine himself during the operation, later reflected on what he witnessed. He described the DUKWs as ungainly, unimpressive machines whose true power lay not in brilliance but in organization. Watching them stream across a river that had protected Germany since Roman times, he understood he was witnessing the end of an era and the beginning of another. That era extended beyond the war itself. The lessons of the Rhine crossing reshaped post-war doctrine. NATO planners emphasized amphibious mobility. The Soviet Union developed entire families of swimming armored vehicles. Rivers ceased to be assumed barriers and became problems to be engineered away. The DUKWs continued working after the fighting stopped. They delivered food to flooded towns, evacuated civilians, and transported displaced survivors. Vehicles that had shattered Germany's last defense now carried aid to its population. The transformation was symbolic. What defeated Germany was not cruelty, but capacity. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Among the factors cited in internal assessments was the unexpected Allied amphibious capability at the Rhine. It was not the largest battle of the war, nor the bloodiest, but it was decisive in a way few operations ever are. General Eisenhower later wrote that no single piece of equipment contributed more to the rapid conquest of Germany than the amphibious truck. Without it, the Rhine would have been a killing ground. With it, the Allies drove into Germany as if geography itself had surrendered. The final DUKW crossing of the Rhine occurred after the war ended. It carried food, not soldiers. German children waited on the far bank, hoping for chocolate. 4 months earlier, their fathers had been ordered to defend that river to the death. The Rhine was never conquered in the traditional sense. It was industrially obsoleted. That was the true victory. The crossing of March 23 to 26, 1945, proved that in modern total war, imagination mattered as much as courage, and factories mattered as much as generals. Germany prepared for the crossing it understood. America brought one it could not imagine. And when swimming trucks turned a sacred river into a roadway, the war was effectively over.